Good morning. So happy that you're with us here today. We have our professor of Christian ethics, Dr. John Hart, who is for the next 4 webinars treating us to a webinar series on social ecological ethics. And today's session will specifically address the scriptural basis for relationship. We do hope that you will stay for the entire webinar, that you'll jot down questions that you would like to ask Dr. Hart at the end of the webinar series, and certainly look forward to a great conversation with you later on. Dr. Hart.
Thank you. Welcome to Socio-Ecological Ethics. We're going to try exploring a new topic, perhaps for most of you, if not all of you. And as Pamela mentioned, we're going to go through a series of 4 of these, and today we start with the scriptural bases for relationships, not only among human beings, but also among humans and other biota, that is, other life beings, other living beings. And then also in terms of our relationships to Earth. So we'll look first again at scriptural bases for relationship, trying to look at some of the origins of a development of socio-ecological ethics. And here basically what socio-ecological practice ethics is, we'll be coming back to this more fully in the final session of this 4 webinar series. But I'll just go through it kind of quickly so you know what the background is as we look into the scripture and the social issues and so forth. Compassionate community consciousness. People are not only aware then of the community in which they live, the extended human family, but also the earth community and the community of all life, otherwise known as the biotic community. And they have this community consciousness, but it's also a compassionate community consciousness. People can be very aware of their surroundings, but not react to them with compassion. Kind of like Jesus telling the parable of the Good Samaritan, who does react to his surroundings, whereas other people just pass by the person who's been a victim of robbers. The word praxis, sometimes people translate it just to mean practice. It actually means a context of a dialogic relationship between theory and practice, consciousness and conduct. So in praxis, what we are doing is bringing to a situation whatever background we have, whatever values and principles and so forth, and we're allowing the context to speak to us so that we respond appropriately with what we have come to learn instead of trying to enforce our particular perspectives on others. So praxis then is the context of dialogic relationship, theory and practice, what we think about something and what we'll do in a particular context, and consciousness and conduct. So what we're aware of and how then we will act within this conduct upon the union of the context and our own principles and values. Ethics and some principles for right conduct in context. These are very brief definitions. You can find whole books in libraries on some of these topics. Social justice in and among human communities, so not just our own people, whoever they are, but extended among all human communities. Ecological justice and well-being among all abiotic and biotic beings. Abiotic beings is non-living or inanimate. Biotic is living or animate beings. So then biotic and biota and abiotic context. The environment, the distinction between environment and ecology. The environment is the context or place in an earth setting. So that's what the word environment is, the setting. Ecology is relationships within that setting. So in this case, what's the relationship between, for example, earth and all biota, all living beings, between earth and humankind, one segment of the biotic community, among members of the human species, among people, and between all non-human biota and humankind. So that's the kind of relationships that we'll be looking at within this general context of socio-ecological praxis ethics. The first part of the biblical teachings, we'll be looking at the Hebrew scriptures, long tradition, and again, all this is in basically summary form, and I might go a little rapidly through this because of our time constraints, but again, you'll be able to at your leisure go back and explore things, take notes, whatever else. So in the Hebrew Scriptures, we see this notion of care for all creation, not just care for each other. It's very important to note that it's not just human beings who are very good. On the last day, on the sixth day of creation, God looked at all God had made and called it very good. So God didn't single out humans and say, you folks are very good, everything is maybe kind of good, but everything is very good. We should keep that in mind. In the flood story in Genesis 6 to 9, you'll notice that it isn't just humans, Noah and his family, that are saved, but all living creatures. Noah is told in the story to take a reproducing pair of every kind of living being. And sometimes there's a distinction between the ones that people are favorable toward and ones that are not so favorable toward. So you take a pair of one and 7 pair of the other. But in any case, all animals are supposed to be taken aboard the ark, which if it had actually taken place would be a stupendous undertaking. So we're looking at a story and interpreting it in terms of finding the meanings behind the story. So God saves all creatures, not just humans. And then afterwards, in chapter 9, after the ark is landed, the animals have all gone out, God makes a covenant. Most people think about God made a covenant with people. Read the biblical verses carefully. God says, I will make a covenant between me and you and all domestic animals and all wild animals and earth. So God is making a covenant with the entire creation, earth and everything that is on earth, and not just human beings. That's also a very important point. It's re-emphasizing that God thinks all creation is very good, not just human beings. Genesis talks about images of God. People debate what is it to be an image of God. Of course, in the ancient Hebrews understanding, God is solely a spirit. God does not have a material form, a body. So what does it mean that we are to image God? I would suggest that the very first thing goes back to the words that God is spoken of as saying, God looked at all of God's works, all of God's creation, and pronounced that it was all very good. So we too, just as God calls everything very good and saves all living beings, not just human beings, we also should look at all creation as very good. And remember, the covenant is not just between God and us, but also extended to all of creation. In the Christian scriptures, just 2 teachings out of a multiplicity of them. In Matthew 6, 25-29, God is solicitous of all biota, all living beings. And Jesus suggests, look at the birds, God takes care of them, God feeds them, and look at the lilies of the field. God is also solicitous of them. So representing all creatures, God cares about all of them. In Matthew 25, verses 31-46, we now have a specific last judgment story that Jesus tells. And in it, he's talking about the final judgment. The Son of Man, or the Son of Humanity, is sitting as a judge before all the gathered peoples. And the questions aren't, well, how many times did you go to church or temple or mosque or whatever? It's basically, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was homeless and you took me in. I was sick or in prison and you took care of me. So when did we ever see you hungry, thirsty, naked, homeless, sick, or in prison? Whenever you helped out the least important person, you did it for me. So the Son of Humanity identifies with all the people, but especially the poor people who are among whom Son of Humanity is present. So when we help out others, we are also effectively helping out this final judge as portrayed initially by the book of Daniel. Another important facet in the Bible is the Jubilee Year. This was supposed to take place every 50 years. It's kind of ambiguous in the scriptures. It says a Sabbath of Sabbaths. The Sabbath year was every 7 years. A Sabbath of Sabbaths would be 7 times 7, which would be the 49th year. But the Bible also refers to every 50th year. So it's not quite sure how, if they counted the first year of the next cycle to make a complete cycle of 50 years, that's why it's generally seen as being 50 years. It's pronounced in Leviticus 25. If you read in Leviticus 25, you have the first several verses are about the sabbatical year or the Sabbath year and what is supposed to take place during this time. And then following thereafter are the requirements for the Jubilee Year. The Jubilee Year is reiterated by Isaiah, first Isaiah in chapter 5, verse 8, where he actually curses those who are, as he says, woe to those who join house to house and field to field, till nothing else remains and you're left to dwell alone in the midst of the land. Those of you who grew up in agricultural lands, you might recall going back in your minds to rural areas where maybe on On the corner, you once had 4 farmhouses. There were 4 families kind of operating a section out from there. And then eventually, over the years, when you go by, there's only 1 farmhouse. They've all been absorbed into one giant agribusiness operation. So people are joining house to house and field to field, much in the way that Isaiah lamented. In other words, because the Jubilee Year, as we'll see, calls for redistribution of the land, it is not being done. And so the prophet will be is basically saying, cursed be those who add house to house and so forth, those who are taking all the property and land for themselves. In Isaiah 61, so we're in 3rd Isaiah now, 3rd part of the book of Isaiah, verses 1 and 2, this is now a period when the Assyrians, rather, at this particular time period, have invaded, and the people are still going the old ways. They're not observing the Jubilee Year. So Isaiah is saying that in the future, he's given up hope on someone doing something in the present. In the future, he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to set free those who are oppressed, to free those who are imprisoned, and to proclaim a year of favor from the Lord. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus comes back to Isaiah's statement. He's invited to be the guest preacher in his hometown synagogue, and he selects the prophet Isaiah 61, 1-2. So Jesus basically repeats, quotes from the scroll, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me, and so forth. So Jesus is proclaiming a Jubilee Year. So something which is expressed first in the book of Leviticus is not happening in the 8th century before Christ, according to the woes of Isaiah, 1st Isaiah. And then 3rd Isaiah calls for someone to pronounce a Jubilee Year. And Jesus says, after he finishes the reading, Luke says he hands the scroll back to the attendant, and he said, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Now people often interpret that kind of in just a spiritual way, that here is a spiritual Savior who is coming to save the world and so forth. But he has just read about a Jubilee Year. 3rd Isaiah said the Messiah would proclaim that, and Jesus says, today this scripture is fulfilled. So he's proclaiming a Jubilee Year. And that kind of sets the tone for his ministry. This obviously is good news for the poor. If you have all these prescriptions of the Jubilee Year observed, things are much better off for you. If, of course, you're one of the rich who has been joining house to house and field to field and not being compassionate toward the poor, this is not good news for you, unless you have a conversion and change of heart. So the Jubilee Year requirements, the first 3 of these are also part of the Sabbath year requirements. They're supposed to take place every 7 years. The first one is rest for the land. During the Sabbath year, a farmer is not allowed to plow their fields or repair the fences they used to keep the livestock in, or in any other way keep out any kind of animals, either domestic or wild. So if you see a deer go through the opening of the fence or hop the fence or whatever, you can't chase them away from whatever you have growing, or any other kind of animals that come in. And the same thing with if some of your cattle get loose, you can't fix the fence, you can take them back and so forth, but you can't make any repairs at all. And the purpose of that is severalfold. One is that you're resting the land, is kind of allowing it to restore, to regenerate itself, rejuvenate itself, and get back to something as a kind of representative of the earth before people came along. Now you have all the wild and domestic animals, and everyone is free to go in and provide for their needs. So it's really a recollection going back to Genesis, when God saw everything was very good. And it also is emphasizing that the earth is God's, something that's mentioned very specifically in the Psalms. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the seas and all they contain. So it's reminding that you don't have a right to chase these other animals away because they are all creatures of God, as are you. And therefore, during this particular time, they can satisfy their hunger by going through your fields, wandering through your fields, and so forth. If anything grows on its own, if you're a gardener, you talk about maybe volunteer plants, you didn't plant those seeds, but it's coming up anyway. You can also, as with the other animals, go out and take what you need to satisfy your hunger. You cannot do a harvest of your land and collect and then sell whatever you gather from a harvest. So you're one with all the creatures then, if you think about it. Everyone can go into the fields and take whatever they need, or the orchards or the vineyards, whatever it might be, and satisfy their hunger. Second is release for slaves. This would be Hebrew slaves. Those who were captured in war, who are from other nations, were not freed. And those who were bought, and they would also be foreigners not from Israel, would not be freed. So you wonder, the idea of a slave at that time was that if you went through very hard times, let's say you had a kind of marginal farmland and there was year after year of drought and nothing grew, and maybe you tried going into debt and borrowing to plant some seeds and hoping this year surely the drought's going to be over, but it didn't end then either. So eventually you might bind yourself and your family into slavery. That is, you would for a period of time work for free just for food, clothing, and shelter for someone else, and maybe one of the more prosperous farmers, and help them, or a merchant, whatever it might be. On the 7th year, you were given the choice to be free from your bondage. And sometimes if the situation remained as bad as before, you might choose to stay with the person who was now your owner. But again, not owner in the way it developed later on in other countries, and of course, including the United States. And remission of debts. So think of that farmer. Drought came, I kept borrowing, trying to save the land, I got heavy debts, and then finally had to find myself over as a slave. So you're in pretty bad shape, and the land is being used by somebody else. So every 7 years again, all your debts are canceled. And since the whole community is doing this, it means that you can't really you can't game the system and take advantage of it in some way, because the community would realize that you don't try to borrow in the 6th year and then have it all canceled in the 7th year. This wouldn't work. So that's the Sabbath year. And the Jubilee year added a very important requirement to that, the redistribution of land. So when the Israelites first settled in what they saw as their promised land, sometimes displacing peoples who were there, sometimes making alliances and working with them, they had to divide the land up. And so they cast lots, kind of like throwing dice to decide which of the tribes would get first choice on the land, and then again, within each tribe, which family had the choice of the best land, and so forth. So if you began with the best land, you probably could weather the droughts, quite literally. And if you came up with the worst land up on the hillside someplace, it'd be very difficult for you to survive in agriculture. And so you get a chance, as poor as your plot might be, it's not exactly an ideal system, but you got the land back. And people would know where their heritage was. That's my farm out there, that's my plot out there, and so forth. And they would be given it back. It was required that it be returned to them. As the years went on, since Israel was a patriarchal society, the property was always passed down in the male line. So if a father had died, his firstborn son, and then when that son died, his firstborn son. If you had a family, the father had a family of 10 children, 9 daughters, and the 10th one was a son, tough luck if you were one of the daughters, the firstborn son is the 10th child. And similarly, if the father and mother have 10 boys, just the first one inherits. The others, if there's enough work, then the firstborn son might hire them on his hands and so forth. So imagine again if you're one of the poor. You can see why this is good news for the poor. If you had become a slave, that's done away with. Your land is supposed to have been rested during this year, so you can start afresh with a regenerated earth. Your debts are canceled, and you get your land back that's now rested. You're free. You have no debts, and so on. A lot of people in agriculture today would like to have that kind of a resolution to their debts, which some have tried to do over the years also. You had a right of redemption during the period when you didn't have the land. So if you were working for a wealthy merchant, for example, you were able to set a little money aside. When you came up with enough, the owner had to sell you back your land. And so you had to have a price that's agreeable both when you originally sold the land and when you went to redeem the land from the other owner. And it was a very set system. You didn't try to factor in 50 years worth of weather and invasions by enemies and so forth. So if you sold the land in the 10th year of the 50-year cycle, the other person got it, and they had it for 40 years. That would be the whole 50-year cycle. So you got the benefit for 10 years, they got it for 40 years, and then the land was supposed to give back to you. If it's in between, let's say year 25, and you've gradually set aside enough money, all you have to pay for the land now, since the owner now has had 25 years worth of harvest, is 25 years worth of harvest. So it's half price. If you sold originally for the full 100%, now you've got the other person has 50% of the harvest, so that's what you get to buy it back for. It's a very, it's kind of a nice system where it's all set in the community and enables people to always have a chance to get back the family homestead. Socio-ecological ethics and social justice in and among human communities, and eco-justice and ecological well-being in all creation. So we're reinforcing what we started with, and we'll also come back to later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. So I'm wondering if anybody has any questions or if you'd like to add a final comment. I'll check to see if there are questions.
I think it's very important to keep in mind that all creation is very good and God has a covenant with all creation, not just with humans. Sometimes you hear people say, well, humans are on top of everything, we are images of God, as if that means that we are to be somehow lords of everything as the Creator is perceived as being. But it's really, we have a responsibility. As images of, we receive a very good earth, we should try to pass it on to future generations also as very good. Some harms have come in, and we should try to correct those harms that have come from the past and maybe from our own present, so that we can, the best we can, restore Earth to being a very good Earth.
Do you have any ideas about the notion of a jubilee for poor countries in relationships with richer countries and very indebted to richer countries? So can you speak about that?
If we go back, let's look at, I'll focus on Latin America. If you go back a few decades when things were very pricey and so forth, people in poor countries who were often impoverished by the rich countries who would buy their natural goods, what people call resources, at a basic price because they're unmodified. And then over time, they'd be shipped to, for example, the United States, in what's kind of a basic colonial relationship. They'd be manufactured into something that people needed. And so the US corporations would ship back the manufactured goods, whether cars, tractors, trucks, all kinds of things that are necessary for a good infrastructure. So when things are really bad and you borrow money, the interest rates were very high, much higher than they are today, so a country pays at that rate. The loans that were given by the US were required to be used to purchase goods manufactured in the US. So for example, you need a new tractor, let's say, for your farm. And so you want to buy it as if you're, the people out there, if you're looking to buy whatever it is, and you have different kinds of that item available, and well, you want to pay, assuming the quality is the same, you try to get the best price you can for your money. That didn't work with the loans that came from the US. People had to buy only US products, so US cars, US trucks, and so forth, which are much higher in price. So it's often said the Alliance for Progress in Latin America, the US made more money from that than progress was made in Latin America. And so around this year 2000 approach, as people, Christians in particular, were looking to celebrate a Jubilee in kind of a spiritual way, at that point, different religious leaders around the world, the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches, the Pope, and others began to talk about a Jubilee Year. So it would be not just this kind of the spiritual celebration with all kinds of whatever in particular churches, but rather also an actual Jubilee in the way that Jesus proclaimed it. That they would be release from debts, freedom from debts, remission of debts. But the U.S. corporations and the U.S. government wouldn't have any of that, so people tried to settle them down to have a lower interest rate to what the current interest rate was. And I mean, banks have made enormous profits, and they continue to make enormous profits, so that was a point too. What is the good news for the poor, in this case the poor countries, in terms of the Jubilee Year? Instead of just having religious rituals, what about an actual way of trying to pay down the debts? During the Great Depression in the U.S., when a lot of farms were taken over by banks because farmers just couldn't produce enough, there was a drought in some areas and so forth. In some areas in the Midwest, farmers organized what they called penny auctions. So you're really in bad circumstances, so you have to leave your farm, and maybe it's been your family for generations, so you're going to have an auction, sell off your equipment, and then finally sell off the land itself. And so when the day of the auction was announced, what the neighboring farmers would do was they put a road blockade right inside the property line of the farm that was being up for auction. And then anybody that came, they would tell them the auction was called off and you should go home. And some of the farmers casually had a shotgun with them too, to reinforce the message that there was no auction. So when the auction actually took place, the only people that were there for that were the neighboring farmers and their families. So when the auctioneer would say, well, what do I bid for this tractor? One of the farmers would say, 1 cent. And nobody else would bid. And that was all very legal, well, not the blocking of people, of course, but the fact that if this is the only bid, the auctioneer, if there's no set bottom price, is supposed to honor it. So I guess they quickly closed down those, and they started sending sheriffs out to make sure nobody blocked the roads. But that was the idea, trying to have a way of saving the farm. Why should the banks absorb all of the agriculture and not instead of these families? And where are the families going to go? They don't want to do farming. They're going to create congestion in the cities, looking for jobs, competition for jobs, and so forth. So that was another way of trying to get a Jubilee on a small basis in one country. And farmers in other parts of the world have called for, they haven't tried penny auctions as far as I know, but it's a similar kind of thing. The banks have really made a lot of profit. Isn't it time to say, okay, that's enough, or even negotiate the interest rate down? That seems a very reasonable request. So those are the kinds of efforts that have been taking place.
Well, thank you, thank you. Well, that's the end of this webinar. Please join us for part 2 later on today, which is at 1 o'clock today. 1 o'clock today for part 2. Thank you, Dr. Hart.
Thank you.